Alex and Sarah had been my study partners all semester until they scheduled a meeting to tell me I was ruining their academic success and future prospects. The text message came on a Tuesday evening while I was hunched over my calculus homework, already feeling like my brain was turning to mush. Can we meet tomorrow at 3 p.m. in the library study room? We need to discuss something important about our group. The formal tone made my stomach drop. Alex never texted like that. She was usually all emojis and casual language, the kind of person who'd send 3 separate messages when one would do. I spent the entire night tossing and turning, running through every possible scenario. Maybe they wanted to change our meeting schedule, or perhaps they'd found a better study method. The optimistic part of me hoped they wanted to celebrate our upcoming finals together. But that gnawing feeling in my gut told me otherwise. The walk to the library felt like a death march. My backpack seemed heavier than usual, weighed down not just by textbooks but by this inexplicable dread. I'd been part of the study group since the beginning of the semester, meeting twice a week in the same corner spot near the windows. We'd shared countless hours together, working through problem sets, comparing notes, and occasionally venting about our professors. When I arrived at our usual study room, Alex and Sarah were already seated across from where I normally sat. They had notebooks spread out in front of them, and something about their posture seemed different. More rigid, more formal. Sarah's usually warm smile was replaced by a tight-lipped expression that made my heart race. I settled into my chair, trying to keep my voice light despite the tension crackling in the air. The room felt smaller somehow, the familiar space suddenly foreign and unwelcoming. Alex cleared her throat and glanced at Sarah, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod. What came next shattered everything I thought I knew about our friendship and academic partnership. Alex launched into what felt like a rehearsed speech, her words hitting me like physical blows. She told me I was academically hopeless, that my constant questions were dragging down their learning pace. Sarah chimed in with examples of times I'd struggled to grasp concepts that seemed obvious to them. They had evidence, actual documentation of my poor performance. Test scores compared to theirs, instances where I'd held up their study sessions with what they called basic questions, and a detailed analysis of how my presence was affecting their GPAs. The clinical precision of their presentation made it worse somehow. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment frustration. They'd been planning this intervention for weeks. The worst part was how they framed it around their futures. Sarah explained how competitive graduate school admissions had become, how every point on their GPA mattered for scholarships and opportunities. Alex talked about her family's expectations, the pressure she felt to maintain her academic standing, and I was the obstacle standing in their way. They suggested I should drop out of our advanced classes and find a remedial study group more suited to my abilities. The word remedial stung worse than anything else they'd said. It felt like being branded with failure, marked as someone who simply couldn't keep up with the academic demands of college. I sat there in stunned silence, feeling my face burn with embarrassment and hurt. These were people I'd considered friends, not just study partners. We'd grabbed coffee together between classes, complained about professors, and shared the stress of midterms. I'd celebrated Sarah's birthday just last month, and Alex had helped me through a particularly difficult personal situation earlier in the semester. The meeting felt endless, each minute stretching like an hour. They were kind but firm, the way you might speak to a child who needed to understand a difficult truth. Their concern seemed genuine, which somehow made it worse. If they'd been cruel or dismissive, I could have dismissed their words as jealousy or meanness. But their careful, considerate delivery made their assessment feel undeniably accurate. I managed to mumble something about understanding their position and needing time to think. The walk back to my dorm was a blur of shame and confusion. Students passed by in groups, chatting and laughing, and I felt utterly alone among all that normalcy. Everyone else seemed to have their academic lives figured out while I was apparently so hopeless that my own study partners had to stage an intervention. That night, I called my mom for the first time in weeks. I didn't tell her about the study group situation, but hearing her voice helped calm the panic that had been building in my chest. She asked about my classes, and I gave her the usual vague answers about everything being fine. How could I explain that I'd just been told I was academically inadequate by the people who knew my study habits better than anyone? Sleep was impossible. I kept replaying every study session, analyzing every question I'd asked, every concept I'd struggled with. Had I really been that oblivious to their frustration? Were the encouraging smiles and patient explanations all just politeness masking their growing irritation? Update 1. The next few days were torture. I started second-guessing everything about my academic abilities. During lectures, I found myself hesitating to ask questions, wondering if they'd reveal just how far behind I really was. When professors posed problems to the class, I'd sink lower in my seat, convinced that everyone could see my inadequacy written across my face. I began eating lunch alone, avoiding the campus spots where I might run into Alex or Sarah. The dining hall felt like a minefield of potential awkward encounters. I'd grab food quickly and find empty tables and corners, picking at meals while obsessing over my academic future. My grades from recent assignments seemed to confirm their assessment. Numbers that had once felt respectable now looked pathetic in comparison to what I imagined they were achieving. I started spending hours in my dorm room, rereading textbook chapters multiple times, convinced that if I just worked harder, I could prove them wrong. The isolation was eating away at me. I'd gotten so used to having study partners that learning alone felt foreign and inefficient. Questions that would have taken minutes to clarify in our group sessions now sent me down hours-long rabbit holes of confusion. My confidence crumbled with each solo study session that ended in frustration rather than understanding. I found myself walking past our old study room in the library, seeing other groups collaborating in the space that had once felt like mine. The laughter and animated discussions that drifted out made my chest tight with longing. I missed the energy of working through problems together, the way understanding would click when someone explained a concept from a different angle. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie awake running through scenarios where I approached them to apologize, to ask for another chance, to prove I could be better. But the memory of their careful documentation and reasoned arguments made those fantasies feel foolish. They'd made their decision based on evidence, not emotion. My other friendships started suffering too. When people asked about my study group or suggested group projects, I'd make excuses or change the subject. The shame felt too heavy to share, too personal to explain. How do you tell someone that your closest academic partners decided you weren't worth their time? I started avoiding certain buildings on campus where I knew they had classes. The architecture school became off-limits after I spotted Alex through a window. The science library, once my favorite study spot, felt contaminated by memories of our group sessions. I was basically redesigning my entire campus experience around avoiding two people. My parents called more frequently, sensing something was wrong even through my carefully neutral updates. I became an expert at deflecting their questions, steering conversations toward their lives instead of mine. The guilt of lying to them added another layer to my misery, but I couldn't bear to admit that I was failing at something as basic as studying with other people. The worst part was how their words had burrowed into my head. Every time I struggled with a concept, I'd hear Alex's voice explaining how my questions were holding everyone back. When I got confused during lectures, Sarah's assessment of my academic hopelessness would echo in my mind. They'd become internal critics, their judgments playing on repeat even when they weren't around. I started researching transfer options and easier majors, convinced that maybe they were right about my limitations. Perhaps I'd been deluding myself about my capabilities, setting goals that were simply beyond my reach. The future I'd been working toward suddenly seemed like an impossible fantasy built on false confidence. Update 2. 2 weeks into my academic exile, something unexpected happened that turned everything upside down. I was walking through the student center when I overheard a conversation at a nearby table that made me stop dead in my tracks. 2 students were discussing a similar situation with their study group, but they were talking about it like it was some kind of strategy. One of them mentioned how their group had deliberately created a crisis to motivate a struggling member, how they'd pretended to exclude someone to push them harder before finals. The casual way they discussed manipulating someone's emotions for academic purposes made my blood run cold. Was it possible that Alex and Sarah had done something similar? The thought seemed ridiculous at first. The pain I'd experienced felt too real, their documentation too thorough, their reasoning too sound. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew stronger with each passing hour. I started remembering small details that hadn't made sense at the time. The way they'd glanced at each other during their presentation, how Sarah had seemed to suppress a smile at one point, the oddly formal nature of their prepared materials. I decided to do some detective work. During my next class with Alex, I paid careful attention to her behavior. She seemed uncomfortable when she saw me, but not in the way someone acts around a person they've justifiably rejected. It was more like guilt, like someone harboring a secret. When I caught her looking at me, she'd quickly turn away, her cheeks flushing slightly. The breakthrough came when I overheard a phone conversation Sarah was having outside the campus coffee shop. She was talking to someone about feeling terrible about the intervention and hoping it would work out the way they'd planned. She mentioned my name and something about finals week being the perfect timing for their strategy. My hands were shaking as I pieced together what had actually happened. They hadn't rejected me because I was academically hopeless. They'd orchestrated an elaborate psychological manipulation designed to motivate me through fear and isolation. The evidence they'd presented, the careful documentation of my struggles, the formal intervention, it had all been theater. The realization hit me like a physical blow. For 2 weeks, I'd been living in academic hell, questioning my abilities, redesigning my entire college experience around shame that was artificially manufactured. They'd watched me suffer through this isolation, knowing they'd created it deliberately. The betrayal felt worse than the original rejection. I spent the rest of that day in a strange state of emotional whiplash. Relief that I wasn't actually academically hopeless mixed with fury at being manipulated so thoroughly. They'd played with my deepest insecurities, weaponized my trust in their friendship, and turned my academic confidence into a tool for their psychological experiment. The more I thought about it, the more complicated my feelings became. Part of me recognized that their intentions might have been good. Maybe they really had noticed me struggling with confidence and thought this drastic measure would help. But the execution was so cruel, so dismissive of my actual feelings and mental health. I realized I had a choice to make. I could confront them directly, or I could play along and see how far they'd take this manipulation. The thought of turning the tables on them was tempting, but I also felt exhausted by the whole situation. 2 weeks of emotional turmoil had drained me more than I wanted to admit. That night, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of confronting them or playing games, I decided to focus on what I'd learned about myself during this ordeal. The isolation had forced me to develop independent study skills I'd never needed before. The self-doubt had pushed me to work harder than I ever had. Maybe their manipulation had backfired in ways they hadn't intended. Final update. Finals week arrived with all its usual chaos, and I found myself in an unexpected position. The 2 weeks of intense solo studying had actually improved my understanding of the material more than months of group sessions ever had. Without the safety net of Alex and Sarah's explanations, I'd been forced to truly grasp concepts rather than just following along with their reasoning. When I walked into my first exam, I felt a confidence I hadn't experienced all semester. Not the borrowed confidence that came from successful group study sessions, but something earned through my own struggle and persistence. Question after question, I found myself knowing answers that would have stumped me just weeks before. The results were stunning. Not only did I pass all my exams, but I achieved the highest grades I'd ever received in college. The forced independence had revealed capabilities I never knew I possessed. My professors noticed the improvement, and one even asked what had changed in my study approach. 3 days after finals ended, Alex and Sarah finally approached me with their grand revelation. They found me in the same study room where they delivered their original intervention, their faces bright with anticipation. They were clearly expecting gratitude for their brilliant motivational strategy. Sarah began explaining how they'd never actually thought I was academically hopeless, how they'd noticed my confidence issues and decided to create a crisis that would push me to reach my potential. Alex chimed in with details about how carefully they'd planned everything, how they'd agonized over the decision to put me through such emotional stress. They waited for my reaction with expectant smiles, like parents who just revealed a surprise party. The silence stretched between us as I processed not just their words, but the casual way they discussed manipulating my emotions for weeks. They seemed genuinely puzzled when I didn't immediately thank them for their psychological experiment. What struck me most was their complete lack of understanding about what they'd actually done. They saw it as a clever motivational tactic, a tough love approach that had clearly worked based on my exam results. They couldn't comprehend the weeks of genuine anguish they'd caused, the damage to my self-esteem, the way they'd poisoned my relationship with academic collaboration. I looked at these two people who I'd considered friends and realized how little they actually knew me. Real friends don't manipulate each other through deliberate cruelty, no matter how good their intentions. They don't experiment with someone's psychological well-being and then expect gratitude for the results. My response was simple and final. I told them that while their manipulation had inadvertently helped me discover my own academic capabilities, it had also shown me exactly what kind of people they were. I thanked them for the unintended lesson in self-reliance and made it clear that our study partnership was permanently over. The look of confusion and hurt on their faces almost made me feel sorry for them. They genuinely couldn't understand why I wasn't grateful for their intervention. In their minds, the positive outcome justified the means, and my emotional suffering was just collateral damage in their grand plan to help me succeed. Walking away from that final conversation, I felt lighter than I had in months. The isolation they'd forced on me had become a gift I never would have chosen for myself. I'd learned that I was capable of far more than I'd ever imagined, but I'd also learned to value my own emotional well-being over the convenience of academic partnerships. The following semester, I joined a different study group with people who understood that support doesn't require manipulation, that friendship means respecting boundaries rather than crossing them for someone's supposed benefit. We celebrated each other's successes without taking credit for engineering them through psychological warfare. Looking back, I'm grateful for what happened, but not in the way Alex and Sarah expected. They taught me that the most valuable academic skill isn't the ability to work well with others, but the confidence to succeed on your own terms. They showed me that true friends support your growth without undermining your foundation. Most importantly, they proved that sometimes the people who claim to have your best interests at heart are the ones you need to protect yourself from most. Their betrayal hurt, but it also freed me from depending on anyone else's assessment of my capabilities. In trying to manipulate me into success, they'd accidentally given me something far more valuable: the unshakable knowledge that I could achieve anything through my own efforts. The irony wasn't lost on me that their cruel intervention had worked, just not in the way they'd planned. They'd wanted to motivate me through fear and shame, but instead they'd taught me that my greatest strength lay in the confidence that comes from genuine self-reliance. For that lesson, I suppose I should thank them, even though they'll never understand why their friendship was the price I had to pay for learning it.